So from the first reading this morning, you realize now that there were two processions that Palm Sunday. The one procession leading the Roman garrison into the city was a traditional one. For Passover was a time when Jews from all over came to be a part of the celebration in Jerusalem, and the Roman occupiers were afraid that this might be the time of the revolt, so they sent a garrison to shore up the Roman oppressors, occupiers. Well, at the same time, out of the eastern gate, significant because the prophets predicted that the person who would really turn things upside down would come in through the eastern gate. So out of the eastern gate, Jesus came in, and he was emphasizing a transformational world, but doing so through peace. So you have these two opposite processions. As soon as Jesus got into Jerusalem, he went right directly to the temple. He wasted no time. Now, this story about Jesus overturning the tables in the temple is very interesting because of the four Gospels, four different accounts of the life and the teachings of Jesus. This is one of the very few stories that's in all four. Some other pretty dramatic things, like the raising of Lazarus from the dead, only get in one of the Gospels. Only one person either had heard of it or thought it was significant enough. But this story gets in all four. What was happening was when people came to the temple to celebrate the Passover, they couldn't use the typical coins of the Roman Empire to make a donation to the temple. They had to use a temple currency. And so when they came to the temple, they would take their regular currency, they would trade it in for temple currency, but they had to pay an exchange fee. And this exchange fee, in some cases, was exploitive. And this exchange fee prevented some folks who couldn't afford to be able to get the currency that they wanted. And the same thing was true if you wanted to make a sacrifice, and you wanted to buy a dove to make a sacrifice. You had to do it there and pay a high fee. And so it became a barrier for some. And many people believe that this act of Jesus, challenging that and overturning the tables, more than anything else he did, some folks believe that this is what led to people to seek his death. Now, some folks are uncomfortable with this story about the angry Jesus. This is certainly not the meek and mild, gentle Jesus of children's stories. Jesus experienced anger and all of the other emotions that we experience. Jesus cried, he got angry, he ate food, he drank water, he drank wine, he went to sleep. All of the things, the whole range of emotions that we experience. Now, lately you've read some articles about people talking about the possibility that Jesus was married. Even this week, about someone who's found a fragment where Jesus seemed to be referring to his wife. And how that seems to get people really, really upset for some reason. But we need to remember that Jesus experienced all of the emotions that we experienced, including anger. Now, not only are some people uncomfortable about Jesus getting angry, but some people are uncomfortable about anger in general. I know when I was a kid, my mom used to say, "Now don't get angry." Okay? Didn't work, but anyway. And I think one of the reasons why people are uncomfortable with anger is they've never seen healthy anger. They've only experienced anger that's destructive, that lashes out at people, that punches holes in walls or destroys things or relationships. However, in the Bible it says, be angry, but sin not. And so it's important for us to be able to focus on some things and really get angry. But to get angry in a healthy way, it depends on what you're angry about and what you do with that anger. Now, in contrast to Jesus, too many Christians and too many churches and faiths today fall on the side of supporting the status quo. When Constantine made Christianity legal, the church went from challenging the religious establishment, from challenging the political establishment, to being the establishment itself. Here's a wonderful, impish quote from an Episcopal bishop named William Love as he talks about how we've gotten it wrong in terms of our interpretation of Jesus. He says this: "Since then, we have been subjected to heavily theologized, heavily pietized, heavily colonialized, and heavily lobotomized interpretations of Jesus. Rather than embracing an establishment Jesus, we who are faithful to the gospel must also follow the Jesus who got angry. There are social situations in our society today, in our city and in our country and around the world, that should make us angry. And we need to continue to challenge religious and political power when it oppresses or excludes." One of the examples of modern-day examples of how this role has been followed is the example of the black church. There's this wonderful book, The Freedom Seekers, Blacks in Early Canada by Daniel Hill. And it talks about the history of individuals and movements and churches challenging the status quo, in some cases deliberately breaking laws in order to be able to bring about justice. It's a tradition in North America that churches have often played a role in either getting people into the Underground Railway and out of the U.S., or being the receptacle in Canada of those who escape and forming communities here in Canada. In many cases, people engaged in illegal activities in order to advance God's call for justice. And historically, black churches have emphasized personal faith, emphasized the power of music in that faith, but have also taken on racism and led demonstrations and stood up against oppression and used music, yes, in terms of personal faith, but also as prophetic witness. We shall overcome is not just about overcoming our own challenges. It's also about overcoming systemic evils in our society. 9 years before Rosa Parks stood up, there was a woman in Nova Scotia named Viola Desmond. She lived in Halifax but went to New Glasgow. And in New Glasgow, her car broke down, and they told her she'd have to spend the night there before the car would be fixed and she could return to Halifax. And so she decided to go to a movie, 1946. And she went to the movie theater and she asked for a ticket for the main floor, not for the balcony that was the black section in the main floor. She wanted a ticket on the main floor. So she bought a ticket, thinking she had a ticket for the main floor. She went in and sat down. They came to her and said, "You need to move. You don't have a ticket for here." And when she went back to the front desk, they told her, "No, the tickets down there are at 1 cent more. And you don't have a ticket," and they wouldn't sell her a ticket for that area. So she proceeded to go back in and sit down where she was on the main floor. She was eventually arrested, assaulted, and charged with tax evasion because that extra penny that she didn't pay had some taxes on it. She was found guilty in court. When she went back to Halifax, her husband encouraged her to just let it go. But when she went to her church, in this case to her Baptist church, they said, "No, you need to fight this injustice." And so she did. But she continued to lose in court. And it wasn't until the year 2010 that she was granted a complete pardon, and the province of Nova Scotia apologized that she was ever prosecuted in the first place. Where do you think Jesus would have sat? Where would you sit? We are called to follow the Jesus who would take on the injustices, get angry, express that anger against injustice, and take action. The historical Jesus lived in a specific context. He lived as a Jew in the Jewish faith, in the context of the Roman conquest of Israel. Poverty afflicted the masses. Taxes disproportionately impacted the poor. And when people turned to their faith communities for comfort and support, too often they faced corruption, fundamentalism, and exclusionary practices of high fees in order to participate. And the poor were disproportionately affected by all of this. Jesus consistently attacked financial exploitation, religious exploitation, and here in this case, these two things were intertwined, and it set him off. He threw out the money changers from the temple. In other words, Jesus was not this airy-fairy spiritual leader who went around trying to convert people. He was a social and spiritual leader who responded to oppression, injustice, and poverty. And great crowds flocked to him. And as a consequence, powerful forces, religious and political, opposed him. I think today Jesus would continue to hold faith communities to a very high standard. And so here at MCC Toronto, we need to constantly examine how we are including and excluding people. For instance, we have men's retreats and women's retreats, adult education courses, and we charge for most of those courses and for those retreats. But how do we make sure that someone's not excluded because of financial reasons, to make sure that we have scholarships and ways to help? We also, recently, when we were doing our renovations, we wrestled with the issue of the main floor washroom. And we looked at other agencies like the 519, where the emphasis is to move towards all gender washrooms rather than gender-specific washrooms, so that everyone was welcome and no one would have to make a decision about what their gender identification is. And so that main floor washroom is called an all-gender washroom, or someone else gave us the phrase, the all-are-welcome washroom, and everyone's welcome. But we also are mindful that some folks are not comfortable with all-gender washrooms. So if we are truly to practice exclusion, we have to hear that as well. So we have a men's washroom and a women's washroom for those who are not comfortable. Unfortunately, as we go through our continual renovation process, the men's washroom was renovated and made very appropriate, and the women's only washroom downstairs was not. And so I'm going to do something this morning that I don't have permission for, but as I say sometimes to our board of directors, sometimes it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. And they are very great. We've talked about it a bit at the edges. We discussed it once, so I have permission. No, I'm sure the board will all be fine. So it's about the latest estimates we have to do the women's washroom properly is somewhere between $17,000 and $20,000. So I'm going never to miss an opportunity. I'm going to ask the men of the church to give me $20,000 after the service today to fix that washroom. This is the way for the men of the church who've enjoyed a wonderfully renovated washroom to help us promote equality in our church. Okay? So as the women applaud, men of the church, you can see me at the back or in the social hall, write checks. 20 of you do $1,000, 40 of you do $500, whatever you want to do. Let's take care of it. Let's get it done. Okay, back to my sermon. For us, doing a all-gender washroom was practicing inclusion. And to make sure that there are other spaces is also about practicing inclusion. And if we see Jesus in the context of someone who wanted to include others, then we can get the message. If we don't see him that way, we miss the message. And we end up following him into the church, but not back out into the world. And we need to do both. So, I'm going to challenge you this morning that wherever you work or wherever you volunteer, that you should look at the policies and practices that are in place and ask the question, how does this impact people? Who is this including and who is this excluding? And if we really follow this Jesus, we should be the conscience of our companies. And we should be the conscience of our communities. Now, learning how to do this in helpful ways, not being so irritating that no one talks to us or dismisses us, but learning the art of how to challenge institutions to change and to be more inclusive. We, of all people, should be raising these questions. For example, schools in wealthy neighborhoods versus schools in poor neighborhoods. Do they both have equal access to technology, to parents' councils, and to funds? Children being raised by wealthy families compared to children being raised in poor families and early childhood education. Are we moving towards equality or not? Recent studies have shown us that people in poverty have less access to health care. And therefore, their health is less. And just a little example, recently with my knee surgery. Great care. So thankful for our healthcare system. But there are little things at the edges. The night before surgery, you have to get this special sponge to bath to make sure that you're ready in terms of your cleanliness and not bringing any diseases in. And it costs $5 to buy it at the little store in the hospital. And then when you're ready to leave, they said, do you have crutches at home? I said, no. Okay, here's some crutches. We'll send you a bill for $30. $35, easily be able to afford that. But what about those for whom that may be difficult? How universal is our health care when we charge people at the edges for some of these necessities? These are just some questions that we should be asking and should be looking at as a society. Here at MCC Toronto, I think we've done a good job of including LGBT people. I think we've done a good job of being the conscience for broader Christianity about welcoming LGBT people. We've done a reasonable but not perfect job around gender balance, around disability, inclusion and access, around sensitivity regarding racial diversity, around heterosexual inclusion and trans inclusion. And these are all in line with what Jesus taught. We don't just do these things because they're the right thing to do. We also do these things because they're mandated for us if we are really going to follow this Jesus. So I want to end this morning with two questions that I want to push you on, okay? Remember, comfort us, inspire us, and challenge us? Well, here's the challenge part. I want you to think about what you get angry about. And my guess is if we took the time, and we're not going to, but if we took the time and I said, think about the last time this week when you were angry. My guess is most of us would say things like, you know, my partner said this or said that, or a friend said this, or at work they said that, or someone cut me off in traffic, or whatever, or something like that we'd get angry about. And I want to challenge you to be angry about the right things. To look around at the social injustices. You can't fix everything, absolutely. You can't get angry about everything, absolutely. But I want you to get angry about something. I want you to look around at our society and say, what needs to change? How does the world need to be transformed? What do I need to get angry about, and what do I need to take on and champion? So think about what you get angry about. And if you want to join with some other folks in some creative anger, some be angry, but sin not work, then take that connection card on the back and say, I want to meet with some people and focus on the way we're misusing our environment, or I want to do something about addiction in our community, or what is the issue that you get angry about, and we'll try to pull people together and work together to address it. The second thing, we began the sermon section and the readings by saying there were two parades that day. There were two processions. One from the west that was about firming up the status quo, of making sure things don't change, of holding the power and keeping people in their place. And the second procession was about turning the world upside down through peaceful means, about bringing about the kind of world that God would want, where everyone was welcome and everyone was included. And folks, you can't sit in the pew for the rest of the day. When you leave this building today, you've got to make a choice of whose procession you're going to be in. And I hope you won't sit on the fence, because to me, the answer is obvious. Jesus said, come and follow me, and we'll change the world together. Amen.